everyone. We're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research. I am Dr. Hinson.
I am Dr. Donnelly.
And happy Pride Month! Yay! So June is designated LGBTQIA or Q+ month around the world. And so similarly to how we handled Black History Month and Women's History Month and all of the other months that we like to celebrate here at Abbey Research, we are dedicating some video content to talking about representation of LGBTQ+ narratives in pop culture, because that's what we like to do. So we figured, hey, rather than doing some more, maybe not as interesting or as fun blog posts about really awesome queer people around the world, we're going to talk about representation in movies and TV and film. So up first for today's video, because the second movie we're covering just came out in theaters and we went to see it yesterday, we are doing a comparative review of the representation of sexuality in Bohemian Rhapsody and Rocketman.
So first of all, we are both non-queer people ourselves.
That's very important.
But absolutely count ourselves as queer allies. So we're coming at this from that lens, clearly. So we've spent a lot of time over the last, definitely couple years listening and learning about this conversation. The conversation of representation is so complicated. Mm-hmm. There are lots of people that are all right at the same time, which is very interesting.
Yes.
And so what we really wanted to talk about with these two particular movies is that they offer some really easy entryways into this complicated conversation.
That's true.
And something that we also like to advocate, not only for ourselves, but for you, is that while there is so much art that can be consumed uncritically, we generally encourage you to do so critically, especially when it's things like this that purport to be true stories.
Yes, it's very, we've been having this conversation a lot this weekend, particularly because for most of our Pride movies, we are focusing on actual events, movies or TV shows that are based on real stories or real people. And I think very often in society, we view those, even in Rocketman and Bohemian Rhapsody, though they are very fantastical and fantasy-based in their direction, we tend to go, oh, that must be how, Freddie Mercury lived, or that must be how Elton John lived. But it's very important to do a lot of research into those so that you can engage with them, not in a way to critique them necessarily negatively, but to be critically thinking about it. And boy, did we learn a lot about the historical differences and inaccuracies in Rocketman and Bohemian Rhapsody.
So you may remember from, and let's say this too, if you don't want to engage critically, that's cool. Just turn the thing on in your brain that says this isn't fact.
This is art.
Yeah, this isn't factual.
Yeah.
That's just kind of, so largely that's the summary of our entire month is this is not factual. So there are certainly some factual things. You may remember from the Oscar
buzz
around Bohemian Rhapsody that there was a whole lot of people calling out the particular narrative around queer representation of Freddie Mercury's queerness and how it was understood and portrayed in Bohemian Rhapsody. Very famously, there are some timeline inaccuracies. And when he told his bandmates he has AIDS in the movie is not when he told them in real life. And narratively for the movie, that's really important. But if you are somebody who knew him and loved him, that may feel like a big betrayal.
And one of the critiques I just read really interestingly talks about how bringing forward that disclosure to right before the Live Aid concert in a movie that is a lot more about Queen, the band, than it is about the personal trajectory and personal life of Freddie Mercury, although he tends to be the focus of the narrative, really does a disservice to that and cheapens the moment because especially the performance of the song "The Show Must Go On," and it makes it about kind of Freddie's disclosure and heroicizing his performance at Live Aid, the show must go on, when in actuality, they were two very different events for the band. And so that was, I think one of the interesting interpretations of that particular change in the historical timeline that makes it not about Freddie Mercury's difficulty, disclosing his diagnosis, dealing with his diagnosis, talking about what it was like to be a gay person with AIDS in the 1980s, and make it more about how it made the band look better.
Yeah,
which is problematic.
There's an article that from Vox that we're going to put in the show notes that talks about the fact that Bohemian Rhapsody was trying very hard to be a Queen concert.
Mm-hmm. One article I read was like a Shazam playlist of Queen's greatest
hits. I mean, they're both jukebox musicals. We'll talk about the differences in how they were treated. Bohemian Rhapsody needed Freddie to be the head of Queen.
A rock god.
They needed him to be a one-dimensional rock god. The problem with Freddie Mercury is that he is like one of the least one-dimensional human beings that has ever walked this earth. So I think it kind of felt like that's why a lot of people felt like it was shoving a round peg into a square hole. The movie seemed to a lot of people like a Freddie Mercury biopic because of how it was filmed and how the story was told, but it never was. It was a Queen biopic. And so you have this narrative where it is bookended by their arguably most famous performance at Live Aid in 85,
I'm not sure. 85, I think.
We were toddlers. So, that, if you contrast that then really quickly with Rocketman, Rocketman is bookended by Elton going to rehab. Which
immediately centers it on his personal story.
Yeah. And other people that enter this are tangential entirely to him. We don't get Bernie Taupin's thoughts on how Elton was falling apart besides what Jamie Bell does on his face. What we get is entirely Taron Egerton telling us the story of Elton John's complete and utter falling apart
destruction
very slowly,
self-destruction
over the process of about 30 years. And so therefore it was not the Elton, it was, this is different too, because it's a band versus a person. We get that. The other difference, of course, is that Freddie is no longer with us, and Elton executive produced his own story.
Yes.
So we have thoughts about who lives, who dies, and who tells your story.
Hey-o, Hamilton reference.
Hey, Hamilton. Everybody take a shot for our theater references.
I know, every time we make a Hamilton reference.
And there's a couple other movies we're going to talk about, particularly we're going to talk about a docudrama called The Laramie Project, which is also about somebody who was the death of Matthew Shepard. So he did not have control of his own eulogy. And that's what the argument really is around Bohemian Rhapsody, is what should Freddie Mercury's eulogy have been, particularly around his queerness. And this is something we're also going to pick up on in the next couple of weeks, is the realities of the AIDS bursting epidemic in the early 80s.
Yeah.
Which is something I think outside of some conversations about Rent earlier this year, is something that is largely lost in a lot of the conversations about the history of queerness around the world. And we're going to use queer as a shorthand, just heads up. Yes. As a queerness around the world, we forget that. And I always pause and listen to a lot of, especially older gay men, talking about what it felt like to spend your entire month going to funerals in the mid 1980s and what that looked like. And that would have been Freddie's life. That was not the life of his bandmates.
And so in terms of how the two movies, really deal with that representation of sexuality, you will find lots of articles, and we'll share a couple below, comparing that specifically. And certainly I feel like because of Elton John's involvement in Rocketman, and because he has gone through this whole process of being okay with who he is, and that's a huge part of the movie. It's just him learning to love himself.
Yeah.
And his sexuality as a part of that, and all of the other parts of him as well. And so it comes at it from that lens, and it spares no blushes. It is detailed and explicit in a way that Freddie Mercury's is. And in full disclosure, I've seen Bohemian Rhapsody and Dr. Donnelly hasn't, but I saw it a long time ago. I'm trying to remember, but I didn't feel that it was as explicit in dealing with his sexuality. And I think pretty much everybody comes to these movies knowing that both of these men were gay, are gay and were gay. And so that colors your interpretation. Obviously, you already have that knowledge coming in. It's not a reveal. But I feel like that in Bohemian Rhapsody, it was not dealt with in a way that was maybe true to how Freddie would have wanted his sexuality to be represented. We don't know.
There's a lot of articles claiming that, and
Yeah.
we're going to link to that. And this is one of there was a huge conversation about who gets to tell stories around the Oscars. So you'll see Bohemian Rhapsody and Green Book mentioned a lot in these narratives. And so we're comparing a lot of art that, you know, clearly never meant to be compared. So we know that, but you'll get some links. Dr. Hinson's not the only person to make that argument.
Yeah, so I mean, I feel like in terms of, while we're talking about these issues around pride and particularly representation, that's one of the biggest ones, right? Is how honest are you going to be with what his life looked like and what his expressions of his sexuality looked like in both of those cases. And certainly in regards to Freddie Mercury's bisexuality, they don't explicitly mention that in the movie at all. He starts out in a hetero relationship with a woman who he was common law married to, I think, who is a lasting relationship throughout his whole life, is his relationship with Mary. And then his gay relationships aren't really addressed. He has a relationship with one of their managers that is equally as toxic as the first gay relationship that is portrayed in Rocketman between Elton John and his manager, John Reed. But they don't ever really deal with kind of what that looked like for Freddie Mercury. He does have a coming out to his parents much later on in his life, and that scene is portrayed, but his parents were a lot more supportive and loving in reality and in fiction than Elton John's parents were. So they do have kind of similar coming out stories in how they were
men of the same generation,
and how they were represented, how those coming out experiences went for those two men, very, very different. But it's difficult to know. I mean, I think that's, for me, my concluding thought is, you know, we can't ask Freddie Mercury how he felt about this or how he would have wanted his life to be portrayed. And his sexuality is just a part of who he was as a human, a very big part, as it is for all of us. But what kind of story and how would he have, you know, would he have wanted to tell, and how would he have wanted to tell that, are really big questions, especially when comparing it to, I think, Rocketman, in which,
oh my gosh, which like
Elton John
just like, here's my vein, here we go. Like,
Elton John is extraordinarily vulnerable and open in talking about
who he was,
which for me just makes it that much more powerful of an art piece, because you know it's coming from that person, and that's how they wanted themselves to be portrayed. And there are still inaccuracies and timelines, and you know, it's a jukebox musical, as Dr. Donnelly mentioned, and it kind of jumps around in time, and
it's got tons of magical realism, because if honestly, Elton John's entire life was magical realism. So,
and when you're that high on cocaine all the time,
your life is magical realism.
Probably what your life looks like.
I've spent a lot of my life working with people in recovery, and I will just say, this isn't about sexuality, but that is one of the more honest representations of therapeutic intervention that I've seen on film in a really long time, and what that kind of looks like and how they go through it. And at the end of the movie, when you kind of see the culmination of his rehab experience in a certain way, the first thought that came in my head was that, God, he works the steps every day. Like, if this is the story he wants to tell, he's still working the steps. Mm-hmm. They tell us he's been sober for 28 years. He told Larry King in 2008 that he went into the facility after seeing himself perform at Ryan White's funeral. So another who died of AIDS, a young man who died from AIDS. If you don't know Ryan White's story, we'll put links in the show notes. It's a very powerful one that changed a lot of people's views on AIDS. Ryan White was a seminal figure in the American narrative on AIDS. And that's what forced him to get into rehab. That's a very common response for a lot of addicts of any breath, shape, version, is seeing themselves through someone else's eyes. So on that note, I would recommend seeing Rocketman. Mm-hmm. It is a hard sit because he doesn't flinch.
We talked about it, and like, if we didn't know that Elton John is still alive and sober and married and happy. If you like going into it,
Ooh, it's hard.
It's hard. It goes through all of that. You would think it ends up in death and destruction from all of what they show you. So it's very, very difficult to kind of watch someone continually get punched.
And I certainly hope that Taron Egerton gets the Oscar buzz that Rami Malek did.
Yeah.
To be completely honest.
Yeah. He was very, very multifaceted in the role, and the acting that his face did was phenomenal.
Yeah. And they all can sing. So have fun with that.
That's joy. I enjoyed Bohemian Rhapsody as a movie, as a piece of entertainment. And certainly I was unaware of the criticisms when I went to see it and the critiques. So, you know, if you love Queen, if you want to see Rami Malek's performance, all of those things are excellent.
Just take them with a grain of salt.
Yeah, without all of that stuff. But that is our first foray into discussing representations of LGBTQ plus identities and lives and stories on television and film. Up next, we will be discussing
the band Played On, which
Pride.
Pride? Are we going to do band first? Okay.
We're doing the movie Pride, which isn't one of the more well-known films on this side of the pond, but was very well received in the UK. So we're excited to talk about that one next.
And then we'll talk about the HBO movie from 1992 called And the Band Played On, which is an examination of the AIDS crisis. And we will conclude with the docudrama The Laramie Project that was also on HBO. And then we're going to have a bonus video. Like the bonus Jonas.
You're welcome.
Talking about the conversation of how movies represent this versus how television represents this conversation, and some things we've learned. And largely what we're doing is curating the conversations we've been listening to for years and just summarizing them for you. So anyway, so that's it from us for this beginning of Pride Month. We celebrate the authentic representation of yourself in whatever version that comes in. In the meantime, I'm Dr. Donnelly.
I'm Dr. Hinson.
We're the Good Doctors of Abbey Research, and we'll see you next time.
Bye.
Bye.